He is best known for his works depicting landscapes and slices of American life.
Diet too.
His minimalist approach reflects a cold and empty modern world. As he watched the city develop around him, his work focused on the alienation that came along with it. Early on, he faced many rejections and struggled to find an audience, but today is considered one of the greatest and most iconic American artists. Edward Hopper was born on July 22, 1882, in Nyack, New York. He was a second child with one older sister named Marion. Their father, Gerry Hopper, owned a dry goods store, and their mother, Elizabeth Smith, raised her children and encouraged them to pursue the arts. Edward learned to draw and paint, while Marion was involved in theater. They both attended private school and later went to Nyack High School. As a child, Edward spent time near the Hudson River and the shipyard in Nyack. He liked drawing people and boats, and would develop a lifelong love of the sea. By the time he was a teenager, he was doing recreations of more famous oil paintings. After graduating high school in 1899, Hopper hoped to start a career as a fine artist. His parents felt that commercial art would be easier to make money in, and he attended the Correspondence School of Illustration in New York City. After only a year, he went against his parents' wishes and pursued fine art at the New York School of Art, which was run by artist William Merritt Chase. Hopper was a standout student, and later on, when artist Robert Henry began teaching, it gave him a renewed sense of passion in his work. Instead of focusing on academic art like Chase had taught, Henry taught that art should be about expressing ideas. Around 1906, Hopper was taking commercial art commissions. Although he didn't enjoy the work, it would provide him the funding necessary to experience the European art scene, a common goal for many American students. On his trips to Paris, he saw works by Impressionist artists like Camille Pissarro, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Claude Monet, and Alfred Sisley. His inspiration from these works led to his own work taking on a looser feel, and he also experimented with natural light. Back at home, he did more commercial illustrations and entered his paintings into group exhibitions. One of these exhibitions was the Armory Show in 1913, which is known for first introducing European art styles like Fauvism and Cubism to an American audience. At the show, he sold his first painting, titled Sailing, for $250.
$250?
This same year, Hopper moved into a studio at 3 Washington Square North in New York, where he lived and worked. His commercial work continued with advertisements and magazine covers, even briefly doing work for pulp magazines. This work gave him enough money to spend his summers in Maine, where he painted landscape scenes. During exhibitions at the time, Hopper was still showing his European-inspired paintings, which art critics had no interest in.
Moving on!
In 1915, he was encouraged by a magazine editor to try etching, which he picked up from friends Martin Lewis and C.K. Chatterton. In his etchings, his later focus on city life, as well as light and shadow, can be seen. In 1918, his etchings began to sell. He was slowly making money with his commercial work, and his prints were being shown in galleries around the country, which gave him some recognition as an artist. His first solo show took place at the Whitney Studio Club in 1920. Hopper met Josephine Nivison, or Jo as she was called, back at the New York School of Art, where she was also a student of Robert Henry. In 1922, they reconnected when they were featured in the same group exhibition. They spent the following summer together in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where they created watercolor paintings of the shores and surrounding houses. Although Hopper had worked with watercolors before, this was the first time he used them extensively in his personal work. The next year, at a show, the Brooklyn Museum purchased Hopper's watercolor painting, The Mansard Roof. This success led to a show at the Wren Gallery, where he exhibited and sold 16 watercolor paintings, allowing him to begin working full-time creating his own work. Hopper and Josephine were married in 1924. As Jo's own career took a back seat, she would play an important part in her husband's career by promoting his work and keeping records of everything sold. She would also be the only female model used from this point on. Together, they spent their summers in Cape Cod, where Hopper would do many paintings of the surrounding countryside. His love of the sea can be seen in his depictions of boats and lighthouses. In 1925, Hopper took his first trip to Santa Fe, where he painted scenes of the local architecture. Back in New York, he painted more architecture, and his unique focus on city life was taking shape. Rooftop paintings were a favorite of his, for their unique vantage point.
I love being on a rooftop. You can really see the whole town spread out in front of you. It really is a crappy town, isn't it?
The 1926 oil painting, Sunday, features a lonely man staring off into the distance while sitting on the sidewalk. This painting sold quickly, and Hopper wanted to recreate this success in his next solo show. The paintings 11 a.m. in 1926 and Automat in 1927 both feature similar, lonely subjects. Hopper always had his own narratives for what was happening in his paintings, but left it up to the audience to create their own stories. Many of his works include themes of alienation and the isolation that comes with city life. As Hopper and Jo spent time going to Broadway shows, theater was another backdrop found in his paintings. Instead of showing actors and events on the stage, he focused on the audience and events happening behind the scenes. Restaurant scenes also allowed him to highlight people who were preoccupied with their own thoughts. Later, as movies became more popular, he again captured scenes of isolation surrounding movies. Another technology that was changing everyday life at the time was the popularization of the automobile in the 1920s. Hopper himself bought a car in 1927.
That Dodge is a finely tuned precision instrument,
allowing himself and Jo to do more traveling. Many paintings around this time had a travel focus and were created during road trips. The thoughts and feelings of travelers was something that always intrigued him. This is mostly seen in his works of trains and the people who rode them, an idea that is seen in some of his earliest works. Another source of inspiration for his paintings came from peering through windows, like a creep. He liked the idea of capturing a glimpse of people's lives seen from an outside perspective. Office scenes are another reoccurring theme, most likely inspired by his time working as an illustrator, but could also be inspired by his appreciation for the artist Edgar Degas, whom he was a fan of. Throughout the 1930s, as the Great Depression impacted basically everyone, the Hoppers were impacted very little. They had always lived a frugal lifestyle, and were still regularly selling paintings. The number of paintings that Hopper was creating became fewer as he got older. He also battled bouts of depression and struggled to create anything for months at a time. He continued his paintings focused on sailboats, traveling, and scenes observed from outside windows. Themes of loneliness and a lack of communication are found in many of Hopper's paintings. Combined with his minimalist technique, it gives his paintings a unique eeriness and emptiness. An example of this comes from his most famous painting, Nighthawks, created in 1942 and modeled after a Greenwich Village intersection. Although not modeled after a specific location, it is instead a collection of ideas that have been pieced together. The painting has a timeless quality, which has lent itself to parody many times since its creation. Hopper and Jo traveled to Mexico in 1943, looking for new inspiration. Later, they returned to Mexico.
Mexico, my amigo!
Why are we going to Mexico?
But by the late 1940s and early 50s, Hopper was in his 60s, and his work was less about travel and more focused on the scenery around Cape Cod. Although he had always played with light, Hopper began focusing on the effects of sunlight and how it interacted with the environment, much like the Impressionist painters had done in the 1800s. Unlike the Impressionists, though, Hopper never distorted his imagery. In 1950, he had his first retrospective exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art. Around this time, he began having minor health problems, with occasional trips to the hospital. The art scene in the 1950s had started to change, with abstract expressionism getting more and more recognition. Abstract expressionism refers to both the color field paintings by artists like Mark Rothko and Barnett Newman, as well as the action paintings of artists like Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. Some painters of realism felt threatened as works of abstraction took up more space in museums. But despite the changes, Hopper's style remained largely the same. He continued to focus on light, but his brushstrokes became more noticeable in later paintings. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he was only doing 1 or 2 paintings a year. As he got into his 80s, his health continued to decline, needing hernia and prostate surgeries. He would spend his last remaining years in his home and studio at 3 Washington Square North. Hopper's last painting was titled Two Comedians, completed in 1965. The painting is unlike other theater paintings, where he focused on the audience. This painting is a clear representation of a final bow for him and Joe. Both figures stand together on stage and look out at an unseen audience. On May 15, 1967, Edward Hopper died peacefully in his home with his wife Josephine at his side. 10 months later, Joe died as well, leaving all of Hopper's work, as well as her own, to the Whitney Museum of Art, along with diaries, record books, and letters kept over the years. Hopper's unique art style and the mood of his paintings have inspired generations of artists. Painters like Richard Diebenkorn, George Siegel, Ed Ruscha, and Eric Fischl were all influenced by Hopper. Many musicians and writers have turned towards his work for inspiration. Filmmakers and photographers have also been inspired by his unique viewpoints, mood, and use of lighting. In the 1960 movie Psycho, the house of killer Norman Bates bears a resemblance to the 1925 painting House by the Railroad, and director Alfred Hitchcock was known to be a fan of Hopper's. Throughout pop culture, the painting Nighthawks has been used in a wide range of media. In 1984, Gottfried Henwein recreated the painting, replacing the unknown patrons with celebrities. The New Yorker used a slightly more festive version for their December 1999 cover. And in 2005, artist Banksy created a parody of the painting, featuring a man breaking the window. In 2000, Hopper's birthplace and his boyhood home were listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and is known today as the Edward Hopper House Museum and Study Center. So, what are your thoughts on Edward Hopper? Do you have a favorite work? How do you think his work compares to other work from the early 20th century? Any thoughts you have on this artist, or anything else worth mentioning, please let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please support this channel by liking and subscribing.